This is Rudy Rucker, and this is a talk that I gave at the University of California at Santa Cruz on March 6th, 2018. I was speaking to Tim Fitzmaurice's class. Enjoy. That's my kick this week, panpsychism. That's the idea that everything is alive.
I gave a handout to all my class.
This cookie's alive.
Yeah, everything's alive.
And if everything's alive, then you're not alone. That's a good way to feel.
Yeah.
Well, there's this guy called Gustav Fechner. He wrote about panpsychism in the 1800s. And it was sort of a popular belief back then, but then the industrial age hit and the computer age. And people are like, well, machines are what matter, and mechanism and computation. And they used to say, well, you know, life, everything in the world is has this sort of glow in it. And they'd say, well, if an atom knows to move towards an atom, Thomas Edison said this, then it has a tiny mind, a little tiny mind at each atom. And it's an interesting belief. And if you think like the dirt is alive and the plants, or if they're conscious in some sort of way, that makes you have more of an environmental attitude. I mean, like when you see, if they're gouging out some hillside and totally trashing it, it's kind of painful to see that. And then if you're a panpsychic, then you're saying, well, the hill actually feels this. It's feeling that this is an unpleasant thing. And then it makes you maybe a little more reluctant to treat the world as some piece of crap that's here for us to use up and just try to get our space mission together before we trash the whole thing. But that's not the main topic I came to talk about today. Whenever, I am always looking for things that I can get some sort of empathy with in my environment. And there's this thing in mathematics and physics that they call chaos. And that's when you have a system that's behaving in a way that's not entirely predictable. And examples of this would be a candle flame, or a trickle of water coming out of a faucet, or some leaves that are blowing in the wind, or air currents, or human life. And these things are chaotic in that they're obeying rules. They're not moving randomly, but they're not predictable because they're just such finely tuned, intricate systems that even if you make a computer simulation of one, the simulation will run, in fact, slower than the real world. You can't keep up with it because it's just got so much crunch, our actual physical world. And so if I'm in somewhere like an airport, I'm always looking around, is there anything here? Is there any scrap of chaos here that I can look at? And if all else fails, you can look at the cloth on the chair. It's disheartening at airports that they have this form of mind control. They want to have TVs running. There's so many places you go and they have televisions running, and they sort of wanting you not to be thinking about anything more physical and chaotic. But certainly human beings are probably the most interesting things that we run into in daily life.
I think in the prison snack bar they play Rachel Ray on TV during lunch. Rachel the cook.
Yes. Yeah, that's sort of.
It's maddening to see this.
Because
there's no way to turn it off. You're not allowed to touch it.
Of course not. Yeah, it's siphoning off your attention.
Right. Maybe we should begin.
Yes, I had really parallel careers. I always wanted to be a writer. Even in high school, I knew I wanted to be a writer. And then it's hard to make a living with writing, even if you're moderately successful. I've published 40 books, but I never made enough money to completely support myself. So for a while, I didn't have another job. My wife was working, and we were living very meagerly in a small town in Virginia. But generally speaking, I needed more money, and I was a professor. That was my other job. You could say that was my day job. And I taught mathematics. I had a PhD in mathematics, and I taught mathematics for about 10 years. And then I moved out to California, and I got a job at San Jose State. And they had this was in 1986, and at that time, computer science was a relatively new field. Generally, people didn't have degrees in it. Often, people who were doing it had never had a course in it. They just sort of started doing it. So at San Jose State, the math department and the computer science department were the same department. And so they told me, well, if you'll teach computer science instead of math, we'll pay you 10% more. And I said, well, okay, I want to do it because it sounds exciting because it's going to be different. And I liked teaching computer science and learning it because it had, so I ended up teaching it for about 20 years. And I like the experimental aspect of computer science. In math, if you're trying to prove something and your proof is wrong, then you don't really have anything. The proof's no good, you know. And in computer science, if you have a program and it has a bug, but it runs a little bit, then you might see something interesting at least. You know, there's this old saying, it's not a bug, it's a feature. You can sort of assimilate it and maybe make something cool out of it. And I always liked, I like visual things, and I liked doing visual computer programs. I liked doing fractals and cellular automata, and then I got into programming simple video games. And that was a course I taught a lot, software engineering, about how to write your own video game. And so that was fun. But a lot of the deeper ideas that I've written science fiction about came from mathematics. And I always had this sort of mystical side to my personality. I always wanted to, even before the 60s, I was already like that. I wanted to, see God and, experience ultimate reality and all this cool stuff. And so I was attracted to aspects of mathematics that had to do with things like that. And the two that attracted me the most were higher dimensions, like the fourth dimension, and the other was infinity. Because these are both these sort of spacey concepts, but somehow they're in mathematics, and they've made a sort of organized ways of describing them and talking about them. And that I like that a lot. So a lot of the science fiction I've written has related to those two things, higher dimensions and infinity. And then the other thing, an element that's come in a lot, is intelligent machines. Because that's something, even before I was teaching computer science, that was very clearly in the air, starting in the 50s and then increasing ever since then. This idea of can we have robots that are intelligent? Could the robots be conscious? Could we take our mind and put it onto a robot? And that was one of the first really successful science fiction novels I wrote. It was called Software, and it came out in 1982. And that, it's sort of a famous novel, because there's this idea that you've seen it a million times now in movies, where there'll be somebody that they're sick, or they're dying, or they just want to do something different, and they'll extract the programs out of their brain, and then they'll put it into an android, like a robot, and then the robot will behave just like them. And then you've got this kind of question, well, is that really the same person? Did they get the whole thing? And but that whole idea, I was the first person to write about that in science fiction. You might even say I invented the idea, though that's probably too much to say. But so the Software, it was a guy where he was a computer designer, and he was modeled on my father, who was an alcoholic. And his name was Embry Cobb Rucker. He wasn't always an alcoholic. He wasn't like a gutter alcoholic, but he had some problems. And I myself, at times in my life, have had that problem. but I'm better now. And but anyway, so I had this character called Cobb Anderson, who's like living on the beach in Florida, drinking sherry. And this was this idea, the government ran out of money for the old people. The book is set in 2020, actually, which seemed like a long time in the future when I wrote this book in 1980. And instead of, they sort of run out of Social Security money, so they just gave Florida to the old people. You know, they can live there, they don't have to pay rent. They drop food from planes every now and then. And then these robots show up, and he designed them. And there's a race of robots living on the moon. And one of the questions, there's this interesting point, can we create a program as intelligent as us? Well, for various reasons, the answer is no. And now, but we can let one evolve. Most of the programs now that do something pretty good, like facial recognition or speech recognition, they're based on something that's called neural nets. It's a type of computer programming. And it's not this dream that you write down a bunch of lines describing how the program's going to work. Instead, you get this, basically, it's kind of like just a network, a bunch of dots with lines between them and different weights on each line. And you run some numbers through there, and it adds and multiplies and subtracts, and you get a number coming out. But nobody has, what's the best way to program it? We don't know. So what you do is you make 100 of them and give them each the same problem, and then the ones that do better, you say, okay, let's make mutations of these guys and throw out the other ones. Then you do it again, and then you say, let's take the best 10 and then mutate those, and then do it again. And you do this thousands of times. And eventually you get a neural network that can do something. It can recognize the letter A, or recognize a B. The post office uses that now. Even handwriting they can recognize. No matter how scungy your writing is, this thing can look at it and figure out. And the program to do that is not a program that's based on sort of logic in the sense that you're breaking it into lines and curves and anything. It's just this big pile of numbers. It's just a bunch of dots with little numbers on the lines between them. And so that's what I mean when I say we can't really write a program that's as smart as us. We can evolve them. And so that's the trick. That's the way to get the smart machines. You have to let them evolve. The catch is that we evolved on Earth over 100 million years, a long time. And Earth, that's a big piece of hardware. We've got an octillion atoms, and they're going all day long, all the time, this huge mass. And so then you say, well, I'm going to get this little chip here that cost me $100, and I'm going to evolve the human race. Well, that's actually not going to happen very rapidly. So we will get to the intelligent machines, but it's a lot of crunch, it's a lot of evolving. So in my novel, there's these intelligent robots on the moon, and they basically have evolved, and that's the way we've done it. We just put them up there. And one thing that helps in evolution is if you're reproducing. So the robots have factories, and they're building new robots, so that they've got the reproduction. And, they're competing, they're killing each other, they're mating, they're blending programs, they're acting like we act. And so then this old guy, Cobb Anderson, the guy who designed them, the robots get him to come up to the moon, and then they cut open his skull, and they take his brain out, and then they slice it up, and they get a map of it, and then they grind it up and get all the chemicals that are in there, and get a complete map of it, and then they get a software copy of it. So that's the thing, the dream. That was the first time anybody wrote about that. So they have his software. Then the way they put it, they have a robot that looks like him down on Earth, and so then they have to put the program onto the robot, and they do that. Software. So the slogan on the cover of the book, it said, "Preserve your software, the rest is meat." So that was cool. So I mentioned there were three things I was interested in, and one was infinity, the other is the higher dimensions, and the other was robot consciousness. Now, I started writing, and it was I knew I wanted to write a novel, and I didn't know how. And then I basically just did it.
How old were you when you just sort of took off?
I was about 29 or 30.
Really? So you started
Yeah.
a little late.
Yeah, I didn't have the nerve to do it. I guess the thing that got me started, I went to a Rolling Stones concert at an outdoor arena in Buffalo, New York. And at that time, I think Nixon was president. And I was sort of a hippie, an anarchist, a pre-punk. I really hated the government a lot. And then to see Mick and Keith up on stage, I know for you all, these are old men. It's like talking about Frank Sinatra, but for me, it was just, yay. And somehow that gave me the energy, and I went home and I wrote a novel in a month or two.
In a month or two?
Yeah.
And which novel did you write?
It was called Space-Time Donuts.
Space-Time Donuts.
Yeah.
Which is still available.
It is, yeah. All of my books are available in one form or another, in ebooks, if nothing else.
Yeah. Go online and quite a bit of Rudy's writing is online.
Yeah, and some of it is free. Actually, that book I was just talking about, software, there's this thing, the geekier of you will have heard of, there's something called Creative Commons, CC, have you heard of that? That's like a book that you put online and it's free. So I actually wrote up, I like these brain-eating robots a lot, so I wrote 4 novels about them. There's software, and then there's wetware, which is set in Louisville, my hometown. Then the gnarliest is called freeware, and that's mostly set in Santa Cruz. And freeware is where you get some software and it's free, but maybe you don't really want it. Because what it is, it's like a cosmic ray that comes through space, and then when it hits a computer, it's like a zip file, and it unpacks, and it's actually an alien mind. Mm-hmm. So it was free. But and then the last was realware. So the 4 of them make the Ware tetralogy. And if you Google Rudy Rucker Ware tetralogy, you can find free copies of it. Mm-hmm. Or actually, if you go,
really worth reading.
Oh, it's a masterpiece. It's a fucking masterpiece.
It's really wonderful. Wetware, I just loved, and that was the first book that I read.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's just really fun.
I don't think I could write those books anymore. I'm more civilized now.
Yeah, you're too stable.
Yeah.
No, I want to ask you about that because your approach to writing was not classic sci-fi. It wasn't, let's have the robots and we have a little dystopia. Let's just solve a problem here and work it out. Sort of iRobot kind of.
Yeah, no. Well, I've always been full of bitterness and hatred. And
you're full of bitterness and hatred. I've noticed.
Well, it has to do of the time when I came up. I graduated from college in 1967. And it's just, a lot of people have sort of forgotten about this. They just think, oh, it was fun, flower children. But a lot of the country very actively hated my generation. Like I had long hair, and people would yell at me on the street. And there's this guy called Spiro Agnew. He was the vice president. And he would talk about putting us in death camps, And then they started this war in Vietnam for no reason, as we now all know. But at the time, it was this big patriotic thing. And I was supposed to go and let them send me there and die for no fucking reason. And if I didn't want to go, I was a coward and a traitor. And you don't forget a thing like that, I'm sure many of you, you come from other cultures, and probably you've had things like that in your own cultures. And it's where the government just goes completely out of control and treats you like an enemy. And these days, we're kind of getting into that again, Yeah. And
you had a reaction to that when you started writing.
Well, it was, and at that time, science fiction had gotten very stale. It was like, I don't know, it was like David Bowie or glam rock, arena. All the books were about people who were hereditary aristocrats and they were colonels in the Space Navy. And that's not where I was at, I hated the military. I didn't want to be in the army, Kill the pig, that was our slogan. And it was very political then.
Yeah.
And for a reason, because they were trying to kill us, and you react to that. So, and science fiction, as I say, had gotten sort of bloated. And so there was this movement that began among science fiction writers And at the time, I didn't realize it was a movement because I was helping to start it. We hadn't even verbalized what it was, but it came to be called Cyberpunk. And the most famous cyberpunk is William Gibson, and then his novel Neuromancer was one of the first really ones to hit big. And then Bruce Sterling, also very eminent cyberpunk. And then there was me and a guy called John Shirley. He's a good writer. He's a pretty good friend of mine. He's a complete nut, but it's fun to hang out with him. And
I might run in the group, actually.
well, yeah, I think it's writers often they're not. It's like musicians are weird, artists are weird, writers are, there's every computer people. So there's everything where you really get very far into some craft or art. Yeah, you tend to leave part of the ordinary world
Well,
behind.
let me ask you about William Gibson, because you actually say at one point, and this will get into the transreal thing, but you actually said at one point somewhere that, in an interview or whatever, that in some sense you came up with transreal because you wanted to distinguish yourself from William Gibson, who's just like this giant of cyberpunk. And as Rudy says, it's a fairly small group of authors, even though if you look at their aesthetic, you're talking about Philip K. Dick's aesthetic. You're talking about an aesthetic of drugs and sex and the wildness of real social life, the way people actually live, poverty, social issues, things like that have all of a sudden been invested in science fiction, It's a fairly healthy version of sci-fi,
Well,
You came up with this transreal kind of notion.
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that in just a second, okay. But let me just say a little bit more about cyberpunk. Okay. One of the things that drove it was, starting in the 80s, we were entering this phase where people and machines have been merging, and that's happening more and more. We're entering the age of biotech now. And I got to look at some of your old stories before. I just had, about 15 minutes, half an hour. And a lot of them are about medical or biological things. And there's a lot of anxiety in those stories. And it's that thing, it's like they're pushing it even further, this merging of machines and biology and humanity. It's not something that we're comfortable with, and quite rightly not. It's people that make machines are usually trying to make money, and that's maybe not what you want to do. You want to be a happy organism. But it was starting in the 80s, and then that's sort of, the machines were being more like people, and there's sort of pressure on the people to act more like machines. So that was the cyber part. And the punk part was, as I was saying, there was this reaction against having glorifying military people and glorifying noble people, or upper class people, or rich titans of industry, and wanting to write about just the skeevy people that you hung around with in your daily life, just these regular people who were not necessarily, at the top of anything. Like that, my friends, they weren't top scientists, and they weren't rich, and they weren't famous. They were just guys and women that I would hang around with, and we'd get drunk and smoke pot. And that was, we weren't heroes of the Navy. So that was the punk aspect, the cyber part and the punk aspect. We see, let's write about the merger of humans and machines, but let's not glorify scientists. Let's not glorify the 1%ers. Let's just have it be punk about regular people, with real lives. And then, Tim just mentioned there's this other aspect of the science fiction art that I call transrealism. And it wouldn't be accurate to say I invented it to try to outdo William Gibson. That's, I like what William Gibson does, but I don't feel in any real direct competition with him. I really honor what he does.
I thought you said in the interview it was like you were distinguishing yourself from.
Well, I might have
something
said that,
yeah.
at any given time.
You might say anything. At
Yeah,
any given time.
yeah. Hi, guys. You're just in time.
It's like the second shift's coming on the next.
Yeah.
Come on down, please don't block up the stairway. We hope that people will come in, and you're allowed to come and go as you please.
There's steps right here.
You don't have to be by the door to leave early or anything. Can I just talk about the word punk for a minute?
Yeah, should we just let's take 2 or 3 minutes off till people settle down.
All right.
Come on in, guys. There's a lot of room down here.
Don't worry about coming down.
Okay. So I'm Rudy. I'm the rude dog.
Do you want the lights on? It's a little dark.
Not necessarily. I don't know. Can you see me? Or am I just this looming silhouette? You can see me? Yeah, I'm Rudy Rucker, and I've been kindly invited by Crown College to hold forth about writing and some of the things that interest me in society. And as I was saying, I'm a science fiction novelist, and also I worked as a computer science professor at San Jose State for 20 years, and I studied mathematics when I was younger. And we were just getting onto the topic of certain kinds of science fiction I've been involved with, and one of them is cyberpunk, and that's a lot of the movies you see, well, like Blade Runner, for instance. You could call that a cyberpunk movie, where it's sort of dark but kind of glamorous, and you've got this real funky stuff like the holograms. How many of you saw the new Blade Runner? Oh, quite a few of you, okay. Yeah, I really love that scene when the guy, he's just sort of nebbish, and he comes home, and he has a wife, but what his wife is, it's like this track on the ceiling with a camera, a hologram projector on it, and it sort of comes rolling out along the ceiling, and there's this woman, in this sort of 1960s ad kind of outfit with the poofy skirt with and she's carrying a little casserole of food, and she puts the food down, and before the hologram gets on top of the food, you see it's this totally disgusting, it's a bunch of fish eyeballs and tentacles, and then zang, the hologram gets on top of it, and it's this nice, tidy, ladies' home journal type Jell-O dessert with little cubes of Jell-O and really nice looking stuff, and she's all cute and bouncy, and then she'll click, and then she'll change, her outfit will change, and that's sort of a cyberpunk thing, where we've got this conversion of reality. There's the physical reality, and we're overlaying this illusory reality onto it. That's the hologram, and then the punk aspect of it is that you're in this completely grotty apartment, and you're eating fish eyeballs, and you're having sex with. It wasn't clear to me how he had sex with this hologram woman. I mean, maybe he had a big pillow with a hole in it, It's just something really low end and punk, It's not the romance that he'd be seeing. So another thing I liked in that movie, just to milk this a little bit more. There's this idea of the punk thing is this idea of our culture not necessarily being on our side but using us and pushing us down and crushing us. And when this guy, this sort of hero of the book, of the movie, he's out on his own in the street, there's this really big hologram of the woman who's been his wife. It turns out she's sort of a basic model, It's like, a Ford or a Kawasaki or it's like this sort of thing you can get, and an iPhone. But the one in the street is 60 feet high, and she's really just gorgeous, and she's the same one in a sense. It's probably in the cloud, the personality. She recognizes him, and she leans over to him, and that's the still they used for the advertising. She's like this 60-foot high hologram woman leaning over him and holding out her finger to, sort of, aren't you cute, And that's sort of how Google is when they do something. They put up a little hello, a happy face on your page when you're looking at something. They know you're there. They control you. They know all about you. They go, oh, aren't you cute? And so then what do we do about it? Well, that's cyberpunk, We have to try to be our own selves and take over whatever autonomy we can possibly find. And so that's one type of science fiction that I like a lot. And again, I mentioned you could read my cyberpunk novels if you go to rudyrucker.com/wares. You can get them free, actually, a lot of them, which is sort of a cyberpunk thing to do, to give away your work, because it's like in Russia, they used to have something called samizdat, where people would just give a novel to somebody and people would Xerox and pass it on. Because the idea is to try to change society. And this is a time when America is really in a very dangerous period, and more than at any time, perhaps during the Nixon years it was pretty bad too, but it's a time when we really need to be careful to stand up for our rights and keep fighting back and don't give in. Because you tend to imagine that a democracy, it's a done deal. You know, you get your freedom, there's this constitution, and you have your rights, and that's all done. And now, what we see these days is, you know, certain people, I won't even say their name, are trying to push things back, take away our rights, you know, repress us, take away things we thought were established, you know, the right to control your body, the right to live where you want to, and take that away. And so it's not, you're never safe. You think you get lulled and you think we have a safe society, we have a safe democracy, and it's not. It's only every generation you have to win the freedom back. And so that's a sort of cyberpunk
Do you think
thing.
so you think that science fiction can be an activist way of encountering the world? Because some of your writing is really sort of some comments from your interviews have said, I'm done with politics, I can't deal with it. You have a way of sort of throwing up your hands about politics. But do you think there's like a political engagement that's possible with science fiction that might not even be possible with mainstream fiction or with other types of...
Well, I think so, because science fiction, it's very good at showing you how a world could be, you know, and imagining how things could be a lot better or a lot worse, this sort of thought experiment aspect of science fiction. And when I say I don't want to write about politics, I think sometimes what I mean by that is I don't want to write directly about politics. Because if I'm in a mode where I'm just continually reacting to the latest, you know, White House press release, then I'm playing their game. They own me. All I'm doing is thinking about, you know, this thing that they're doing. And it should be possible at some point to turn your back on it. Cory Doctorow published a novel last winter called Walk Away. And that was the theme it was about. It was about a future society that's become much more repressive than we are now. Things really, sometimes I can get worked up about it, but you read science fiction, you can read about places that are really a whole lot worse off. But in a world like that, there's a movement called Walk Away, where people walk out of the cities and they go out and you know, build their own semi-utopias out in the countryside. And that was also a movement in the 60s too, people getting into communes. So the walkaway movement is a way of getting out of the political system. So personally, there's a lot of things I like about being in society. You know, I like the internet, I like TV, I like good restaurants, you know, I like going to the movies, I like buying clothes, you know. There's you sort of need a society to some extent. Like one individual ant, there's not much an ant on its own can do, you know. So we are these sort of hive creatures. But science fiction is can be a way of trying to promote a freer society.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe just to get started a little over again, you're the great-grandson of Hegel, George Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
Hegel is the last comprehensive philosopher in the Western tradition, I think. He's the one that, from beginning to end, he created philosophy from beginning to end, and looked at every different aspect of philosophy. Michael called him an epistemologist, but he was an ontologist. He was everything.
Mm-hmm.
He was one of the rare philosophers who's everything. He might be the last one, actually. There's another guy around. But the point is, what do you make of that? That relationship is something that you do talk about.
Well, yeah, he's my triple great grandfather. And I have to confess, I have not managed to read. The book I'd like to read all of would be Phenomenology of the Mind. That's his big book. And it's very dense. And well, then I tell myself, well, maybe if Hegel was alive, he'd be writing science fiction. That's a possibility. And
he kind of did, in some respects. He kind of wrote some
Historical dialectic is kind of science fiction.
Yeah, he actually had his own little ways, but master-slave relationships or things like that, things that he did that were.
He had one analogy I liked a lot. He said, when I want to see an oak tree, I want to see the full vigor of the trunk and the flowering leaves. I'm not satisfied to be shown an acorn. And I thought about that a lot over the years, because an acorn really is an oak tree, but you just need to add a lot of computation, and in the sense that a growing organism is carrying out a natural computation. So it's kind of nice that we can grow things like that. Something backing up just a little, I'd mentioned there were two types of science fiction I'm interested in, and one is, as I say, cyberpunk, and the other is transrealism. And that's a word, I made the word up, so it's safe. I can say it means whatever I want it to. And but what I mean by it is, rather than just writing, the thing about like something like Star Trek that sort of leaves me cold is the characters. They're not really like people. I know they're not very rich. They're not very richly detailed. Some people, if you really get into it, you could argue with that. You could say, well, the captain does such and such. But I like a science fiction book where the characters are more like actual people. And it's almost like, what if I wrote a realistic novel about my life or the life of the people around me, with all the sounds. We were talking about this before, the smells, the sounds, the little details that you see, the quirks of people's personalities, but then add in something science fictional. And it's not necessarily just adding it in. You don't just clump, here's a time machine, what are they going to do? You can do that, but I think it's nice if the science fictional element that you add in some way represents something that's important to the people's psyche. Like, people don't like the idea of dying. So it's some appeal to have science fiction where people find some trick of making themselves immortal. Or the idea of time travel really has to do with the idea, why that's important to us, is because we would like to go back to our past. You'd like to go back to your family, you'd like to go back to the good old days in high school. That's the past. In the future, you'd like to be able to find out what happens. So these are these sort of scientific things that stand for things that are important to you. Now, there's not really that much difference between science fiction and fairy tales. In fairy tales, they just call it something else. In science fiction, I have this wand, this matter manipulator, and then in a fairy tale, it's a magic wand, or in science fiction, you levitate, or you have an air car. In a fairy tale, you have, a magic flying carpet, or you have, wings. So a lot of these things, we like the idea of these powers, and we like the idea of thinking about how they would change their lives. So that's an aspect of science fiction that I like too. And I think when you see good science fiction now, it's things where you tend to feel like it's about real people.
Is there good science fiction right now? People you could recommend?
Well, I mentioned that book by Cory Doctorow, Walk Away. Yeah. And then there's a book by a guy called Chris Brown, and it's called The Tropic of Kansas. And that's an extremely political novel. It's where there's pretty much a state of out-and-out war between civil war in the United States, between the repressive government and the rebels. And that's an interesting book to read. It's a strange title, The Tropic of Kansas. you'd think Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn, it's Tropic of Kansas. But it's a very cool book. And whatever William Gibson does is always worth reading. His most recent one was called The Peripheral. And that was, and again, where he really excels at doing the transreal thing, because all his characters, they're like somebody in a small town, a woman, her brother's a vet, and she works as a waitress, and it's just these very down-home, regular kinds of people, like you might know. And the trick in The Peripheral, one of the things that's hard to write about is time travel. People are always trying to do time travel, and there's always all these rat holes you can fall into. What if I go back and kill my grandfather? Then I wouldn't be here, so I didn't kill him, so then I can go back in time and kill him. And you get these sort of loops, and it's...
You made lists of the tropes of science fiction.
Yes.
In your, online, you can read Rudy's essays.
It's an essay called What Do Science Fiction Writers Want?
What do they want? Yeah, what do science fiction writers want? And there's like a list of the tropes, and I've given out that list. I gave it out in prison, and I gave it out to my class. And I've given it out to people just so they can look at it. And these are the usual things that people often write about in science fiction. And they include things like time travel.
And telepathy.
Mortality, telepathy.
Telepathy is a big one because you always have this dream that people might understand what you were talking about, Like your family, at least, if only they could hear me. And telepathy. And what would telepathy be like? Not clear. Part of it is empathy. That's something that I've found hard to learn. I have more empathy than I did when I was 20. You all probably don't have much empathy. Maybe a little. But if you have children, they sort of beat it into you. And if you have jobs and get fired and, go through all the ups and downs of life, empathy is, to see other people from the inside, which is, it's easy to say, but I always have found it hard to do for a long time. To look at somebody instead of putting them in a box and saying, well, that's such and such a person, I know all about them, they like this, like that. But instead say, how would it be to be them and look out through their eyes? And then you say, oh, wait, on the inside, they're really the same as me. They're not any different from me. They have the same things, the same worries. And so that's getting close to telepathy. But with full telepathy, how would it work? It's kind of a miracle that we can talk to each other, because I'm just like this mammal, and I'm making these grunts and squeals, and and you're hearing them, and then somehow you transform them in your head into ideas that are maybe something like what I'm saying. I'll never really know, but unless I give a pop quiz, that's not going to happen. So it's kind of a miracle that speech even works as well as it does. And telepathy, there's the sense there might be some much richer channel that we could use. And it doesn't seem impossible.
There's a great Asimov story where the robot has telepathy. And so then he has to start lying, which is against all the rules. Because he feels like he's going to hurt people. Because that would be against the Asimov's laws, right? So he has to lie all the time about what people think and whether they're in love with each other and all that kind of stuff. Gets himself tangled up in knots.
That's always an issue in stories about telepaths, where you know too much.
But it's nice when it's a robot instead of a human.
Yeah. A robot's the last person who would have telepathy, actually. But I mean, it's a good idea for the story.
Can I say something about empathy? One of the stories that you wrote was about empathy, and the word empathy came up quite commonly, and it was a really wonderful story. And incidentally, I just want to say, we've got 30 great stories, and we're going to give those prizes at the end of this event to the people that were, we'll talk about that later. But the point is that empathy is something that I think can happen if you're able to define, when I look at Ursula Le Guin, or I look at other writers, I think they create other worlds so that they can actually teach us to understand other people and to start to attend ourselves in an empathetic way toward other people, understand that other people are different. And I think the notion of the punk, I just want to say something about the punk. Punk used to be a word for homosexuals. Just sort of think about what punk is. It's a little piece of, it's like a little wick that you use to light other things, and it smokes and it goes out and it doesn't really catch fire. It was thought to be, you're a guy that doesn't catch fire, you're a punk. And so it was used as a derogatory term against guys, maybe like Rudy, but like me, when I was in high school in the 60s, you're a punk. And you're a punk because it was an attack on your sexuality as well as other things, right? So that word grew through the 40s and 50s in that way. And then punk rock absconded with the word. And cyberpunk took away the word. In other words, it said, screw you. We're going to control our relationship to, you talked about it in terms of the military and whether people thought you were brave or cowardly or whatever, that kind of thing, because you resisted the military in the 60s. Well, I think that word is really important because it was a way of taking away the power from people that were calling you a name. And that was a very popular name in the 50s and the 40s, 50s. It was a very popular name. It probably goes way back. It probably goes way back to the Middle Ages. Because it, like I say, it comes from a physical reality. And so I think that's what I see happening with cyberpunk writers. They're saying we're not going to be Isaac Asimov.
Well, no, we're garbage, but we're going to be better writers than you. It's sort of like the Ramones,
Yeah.
We're going to play a really dumb, simple song,
or garage rock and roll of the 80s punk rock.
Yeah.
It was like, we will be authentic and we're not going to be post-produced.
But
we're not going to be reproduced and
But that's over now. I mean, you have something else that you are that's revolutionary. I don't even know what the word is, but...
What's that?
What would young people call themselves these days? Hipster? There's probably some better word. Something cooler than that.
Well,
you're not going to tell me?
I'm going to say...
Huh?
It's a generational secret.
A generational secret. The millennials hold out.
Well, I think that your generation, has told me that they think some people are woke and some people aren't. True. It's absolutely true. Some people get it and some people don't. And they're looking around them and saying, this person gets it and these people don't get it. And that's the way we were.
Yeah.
We were saying this, I was put in jail by a bunch, when I was hitchhiking in New York, and the cops, they basically wanted to hurt me. They wanted to hurt me badly in Schenectady, New York County Jail, And it was because I had long hair and I looked like a guy that hitchhiking and maybe used drugs or something. The point is, there was a different way of dealing with this, and it was a small percentage of people that were in my generation woke. They got it. They understood it. They understood what was happening, and other people didn't understand it. So I think there's a different way. Every generation has it. Every generation has it. And I think that's certainly true of cyberpunk.
Yep.
That's what it's about. It's social. It's not just technological, scientific, or something. It's looking at the ethics of it.
One last thing, I'll just say a tiny bit more, and then we can do some questions.
Yeah.
I've been talking about different styles of writing, and you all have all these stories you wrote, and as I say, I looked at some of them, and I think they're pretty good, pretty interesting, cool. A lot of anxiety around medicine and biology and families. And I just wanted to make a few remarks about how to write. And one is it's always good if you, at the core of the story, if there's something that really bothers you or that you're really concerned about, either in a way of really wanting to do it or really not wanting to do it. And so that's good. And then it's always good to have at least 2 or even 3 is better characters if it's just one person talking, it's not as good as if there's somebody else that they're talking to and they're playing off. So that's always good to have a couple of characters. The characters, it's always good also if you can do whatever you can to not have them be stick figures, just, a head and two arms and they're talking. So think a little bit about what they look like. And a cheap trick that I often do, if I need a character, I'll just pick somebody that I've seen, or that I know is a friend of mine, and I'll just say, well, let's just make this character look like that person. It's like if you're an artist, you'd say, well, I'm just going to use a model and then just copy this model for this figure in the picture. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad reflection on that person. And if it is, then you don't really have to show them the story. I did lose a friend once where I showed him a story where I'd based a total asshole on him. And he noticed, I liked him, but there are these aspects about him. But so you have to be a little bit careful with that. So the characters make them be real. Another thing is, it's often useful if you're not able to write on the story. It's always good to have a notes document, and then there you can write about how you can't write. So you could have like two separate computer files, and one is the story or the novel, if you ever get to that point, and then you have another document called the notes. And then in the notes, you can write down ideas you have for the story. If there's things that you like in the story, but they actually suck in terms of the story, then you can cut that paragraph out and save it in the notes, so it's not lost to history. You hate to throw out something you wrote. And the other thing, you can write a little bit, usually outlines. It's pretty hard to actually do an outline. It's sort of a computer science issue that you can't actually simulate the process of your writing the story much faster than you can write the story. So it's kind of hard to get a really deep, thorough outline before you've written it. Though some people like to outline, and it doesn't hurt. It's anything you can do to get the ideas going. So those are just a couple of ideas I wanted to throw out there. And so try to use real characters, try to have more than one character, have the story relate to something that really bothers you, and have a notes document where you can sort of just write some thoughts you have about the writing. So maybe we should enter the next phase of this.
Sure. Anybody have any questions they want to ask?
Questions?
Any comments you want to make about the writing?
Yeah, Provost.
You mentioned that one of the things that gives quality to a novel is the texture of the characters.
Yes.
They look real.
Yes.
So how different is in that sense science fiction from regular fiction?
It's not a huge difference, and I feel like there shouldn't be that much difference between science fiction and a regular realistic novel. There was sort of, in the 50s, the sort of pulp years of science fiction, there's this feeling, well, we're getting paid, 2 cents a word. We're not going to, our readers are dullards. We're not going to exert ourselves and try to write real literature. But then it's become more a feeling in science fiction that if you can take the trouble and make it, that level of polish that you have in real literature, that's a good thing. And there is something that's happened. There are a lot of mainstream novels now that are what really most people, science fiction writers say, well, that's a science fiction novel. I mean, if you look at the books that get reviewed, like on the Sunday New York Times, very often they have some science fiction idea at their core. But they don't like to say that, because if you say something science fiction, that means it's crap that's written by morons and it's read by morons. So better not call it science fiction. So instead they'll say it's visionary, or, imaginative, illuminating, delves into the futures of our ideas. But they don't want to put that word science fiction on it, because, it's like calling something punk rock. It means it's no good.
What writers have inspired you?
Well, my favorite writers are, I love the writer Thomas Pynchon. And not everybody have read him. He's sort of, his books are maybe a little bit difficult and complicated, but I really love his style, the way he writes. Thomas Pynchon. Jorge Luis Borges, he's written these wonderful imaginative stories. He's Argentinian. He was one of the great masters. And if you can get hold of a book of his stories, they'll really blow your mind, even now. It's this interesting thing. You can do something that's like fantasy or science fiction, but it's not about kings on thrones, and it's not about rocket ships, but it's just about some very strange things happening. And those are wonderful. So those are two that I like a lot. Just this week I happened to read Ursula Le Guin's novel, Left Hand of Darkness, that somehow I'd never gotten around to reading that. And then, she died this year, and I thought, it's really high time. And that's really a wonderful book. It's one of the best books I've read. Really beautiful book, Left Hand of Darkness. The title, it's sort of a yin-yang thing. It's like a Taoist thing. There's this kind of chant they have, and then it says, light is the left hand of darkness, and darkness is the right hand of light. So it's this sort of cosmic unity thing. So that's what the title means. It's not obvious at first. And it's interesting, talk about a thought experiment. It's about a society where everybody is ambisexual, or there can be either male or female. And only for 4 days a month are people, they enter this state that they call Kemmer, K-E-M-M-E-R. And that's, with animals, it's like being in heat in the sense that some animals, there's certain times of the year when they want to mate. And when you're in Kemmer, you go to the Kemmer house, and the other people in Kemmer are there. And then you find somebody you like the looks of, and then, you go to bed together, and you might then have male genitalia, or it might be your female genitalia that sort of come alive. You don't even know when you lie down, am I going to be the man or the woman? And usually it works out so there's one of each, Not always, but usually. And so the way that affects the whole society, because anybody is in a way male and in a way female. And there's certain things that don't happen, like there's no wars. People may kill each other now and then, that can happen, but they're never going to have that delusion, that mass delusion that men can generate, that it takes to actually start a war. You have to get thousands of people to be completely stupid in the same way at the same time. And if a lot of the people are women, it's not going to happen. But it's a very cool book, very interesting.